Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
And yes, seems like we are alive mostly everywhere, except every other site that I decided not to send it anymore because they are blocked in Brazil, like Rumble, Twitter now. Well,
Did you say,
what's
Marcelo,
next?
hello? Did you say live or alive? I just wanted to clarify. Or both?
Both.
Both.
By now, both, I guess.
We seem to be alive. We seem to be caffeinated. I think I'm losing my voice a little bit. It might be the forest fire smoke that seems to be nearby. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Winter Latina Show. I am extremely excited about today's guest, whose work I've been following for a very long time, probably since around the beginning of the conflict in Syria. This is Eva Bartlett, or perhaps today she likes to go by Eva, which would be the Russian version of the name. She is an American-Canadian independent journalist who currently resides in Russia. She is someone who actually travels to the places that she covers. So she's reported from different places in Palestine, in Syria, like I mentioned, in Donbass, in Venezuela, and I think this is a pretty interesting contrast to some so-called journalists who prefer to report from their armchairs in their comfy offices in the mainstream media, which is why we highlight the topic of independent journalism in this particular episode. And of course, Eva gets to know the people on the ground. So from my perspective, that human component is really important to her coverage from what I've seen. And it kind of gives us additional dimension from what you would see in typical mainstream media news coverage. So Marcelo, let's bring on Eva or Eva on.
Yeah, and here she is.
Well, welcome. Super excited to see you here. Please correct me right off the bat if I messed anything up, if I missed some of the locations where you traveled to and covered. And anything else you'd like to mention about yourself before we jump into the questions?
No, yeah, you covered it just fine. Thank you. I appreciate the little personal details you added.
Okay, well, welcome. So the first question I think is an obvious one. I'm not sure what your university education was in, but how did you become interested in journalism and specifically focusing on independent journalism? Because it's sort of the, proverbial road less traveled. It's something that to me seems much more difficult to handle, not just from the political standpoint of perhaps challenging narratives, but traveling to places that could be dangerous if they're a conflict zone. So what was your initial interest in this field?
It might seem to people who haven't heard me talk about this before, it might seem counterintuitive that I was not at all political. I wasn't interested in anything to do with the news or politics. I came from a musical background. My parents were classical musicians. I was a classical pianist to some degree, university. And I never paid attention to news, politics, or much of anything. I was not an unempathetic person. I just wasn't interested. I came from the Canadian education system, which I know you're aware of. That was extremely boring. So I leaned into my artistic side, which is more music and languages. After high school, I didn't know what to do with myself. So I went on to study classical piano, which I already played. I did an exchange in my third year and to France. And so I had a lot of opportunity to travel in Europe. And I actually had done a lot of independent travel before and then throughout university. So I think that was very important in kind of how I came to the path that I came to. But anyway, when I finished university, I was like most North Americans or most Westerners, in debt. Um, I wasn't as in debt as many, but I still was in debt. So I got a job teaching English in South Korea. Now, I thought I was being unique in going to South Korea because everybody I knew was going to Japan or China, but it turned out there was a lot of Canadians in South Korea. I enjoyed it there. I taught there for 2 years. I paid off my university debts. In between the first and second year, I traveled for 8 months in Southeast Asia, simple third class, second class bus travel, hitchhiking. I had some really interesting experiences. And in fact, I did a lot of really interesting, simple travel before I got political. But I think that was a part of me becoming political, because traveling in Southeast Asia, you see the effects of imperialistic wars and policies on that region. But I didn't know any of that at the time. I was just kind of maybe subliminally absorbing it. And then in my second year in living in South Korea, I guess after all the travel in Southeast Asia, when I came back to South Korea, I suddenly wanted to listen to news. It was never a thing for me. And I had internet in my apartment, and so I'd never had that before either. So the combination of the two, I started listening to news. And at that time, this was 2003 or four, I don't remember exactly, maybe 2005, 2004, 5. And Palestine was being talked about a lot. So every day I would listen to this particular channel, which I'm not going to name because they're crap, but at the time they were my introduction to things. And so I just really started feeling concerned, like, why didn't I know any of this before? And how is this possible? This is going, I was so naive. How is this possible? This is going on. The things I was listening to, hearing about, sorry. And I just kind of became not fascinated and not obsessed, but I wanted to learn more. And then at some point, I'm still teaching in South Korea. I'm doing Taekwondo. I'm living my life. But at some point, I decided, okay, I have to go there at some point and see for myself. That didn't happen until 2007. And I did go to the West Bank. Then I spent 8 months there. And I do have blog posts from that time. I didn't use my real name because I didn't think it was important to use my name. I thought the issue was important. But in the space of the 8 months there, and I was there as an activist, I saw quite a lot of oppressive policies, to put it mildly. But I'm trying to, not get anyone censored on YouTube. So, but I saw a lot. I mean, I wasn't just sitting in an apartment or a hotel. I was throughout the region and seeing all the oppressive policies you can imagine when it comes to that particular topic. And by the time I was deported from there, I was very, I'd seen so much, it was impossible to go back to just normal life. And so I became very involved in matters Palestine. The next year I went to Egypt. I spent a lot of time trying to get to Gaza, but I could not. Eventually I went back to Canada, and then I flew to Cyprus and joined a boat movement, and we sailed to Gaza. I was on the third boat that sailed there. We actually made it there, surprisingly. So that was November 2008. And then for the next, year and a half, I was there. I left in mid 2010, and then I went back the next year, and I spent another year and a half. And so during that time, I was there during 2 wars on Gaza. I saw things I never would have imagined I would see in terms of death and related. And at the same time, I was in a very dangerous place. The people were incredibly loving and kind and welcoming and hospitable, but what we were dealing with was extremely dangerous, from every possible venue: air, sea, tanks, drones. It was all there. And we didn't have body armor, but very quickly you adapt to it. And that might sound strange, but I think you have a background in psychology, and you could probably explain why that is, that you adapt quickly to those circumstances. So it became, unfortunately, kind of normal to be living in a place where at any moment you could be bombed or shot, but such was the reality. And I morphed from activism to writing. So I had been publishing. My first blog had OPT 2007.wordpress.com. Then I opened a blog when I went to Gaza, at WordPress.com. And I was just trying to publish what I was seeing. I opened Facebook, and I wasn't interested in it, but I opened it for the sake of sharing there. And because there weren't that many foreigners, there was maybe 5 or 6 or 7 foreign activists there. Um, it was there was a desire to hear, from. I mean, I always like to put Palestinian voices first and foremost in if we're talking about that region, but there was a desire for English speaking writing and interviews and so on. So I started writing for various publications. A lot of them were for free. Interpress Services actually paid me, and at some point I started writing for RT. In any case, I'll try to shorten my answer, but basically, I saw a lot in 2007 in the West Bank, and then in the 3 years that I lived in Gaza. And then during that time, the war on Syria began in 2011. And I had no idea about Syria, just like I had no idea about much of the world. But I started looking at news that I trusted, and the narrative, or rather the information they were putting out, was in contrast to the NATO narrative on Syria, which was essentially the president of that nation was an evil dictator who needed to be overthrown. That's the NATO narrative, as you know. But I was seeing, and I consulted people that I trusted from the region. And so I quickly understood in 2011 that wasn't the truth. In 2014, I finally went to Syria for my first time and kept going there over the years. And, it was a very similar to what I was seeing in Palestine, but in a different manner, because in Syria, as you know, the West harnessed terrorist proxies, sent them in there to so-called have a revolution. But what they were really doing was shelling and sniping civilians, whether in Damascus or Aleppo or in various cities and villages. And at that time, it wasn't popular to be saying or writing the things that I and later my colleagues were saying and writing, but it was the truth. And I mean, again, once you've spent time with people in those circumstances, if you don't tell the truth, there's something really wrong with you. And it became a challenge at first. As of late 2016, the corporate media descended on myself and my colleagues and lambasted us. And at first, it was hard to deal with, but then you got used to it. And so eventually it got to the point where it doesn't matter. Like they're going to copy paste from the Wikipedia entry, which you did not read from. Thank you. And it's all about trying to censor you from speaking about what you've actually seen and know to be true. So, that's basically how it started, with a very one specific issue, and then realizing it's all interconnected, whether in Venezuela or in Syria or in Donbass, and the things that what's happening between Ukraine and Russia at this moment, it's all interconnected. And unfortunately, I've seen, for example, with Syria, people who are supportive of Palestine fell for the narratives on Syria. So that became a very divisive point. But with time, some people realized, okay, they were misled by Western corporate media and all these fake human rights groups that feign concern. So while I was reporting from Syria, again, from 2014 on, spending a lot of time there over the course of those years, I was aware of what was happening in Donbass, but I wasn't that well informed, I have to admit. I was aware of the basics about, the events in 2014 in Kiev and Odessa, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't have the chance to go to the Donbass till 2019. I spent a few weeks in the DPR, the Donetsk People's Republic. Didn't speak a word of Russian, so obviously I'm dependent on assistance in that regard. But I was able to visit areas and I do think it's important to mention this because this is prior to February 2022. This is September 2019. So I went to Gorlivka and Zaitsevo and areas around there, Yasinovataya, and just talked to the civilians that were living there and heard about what they were suffering under Ukraine's shelling. Wrote about that. I went to Crimea, also a region I knew nothing about. In fact, in 2014, when Crimeans held their referendum, I was oblivious to it because I was in Syria. I was tunnel vision, so I wasn't in fact, I would say for most of the issues that I've come to write or address or speak about, I was honestly ignorant and oblivious to them. So I guess I can say that in that regard, I was like a white piece of paper in that I didn't have any previous biases. Maybe I had some, I don't know, but not the ones that came from Western corporate media and fake human rights groups and, fake empathetic words from Western corrupt politicians. So when I went to Crimea in 2019, I had a good idea by that point what I would hear, and certainly it is what I heard. People were very happy that Crimea returned to Russia, as they told me. They didn't say join; they said return. They said we've always been a part of Russia, and they spoke about all the massive developments in the country, in the peninsula since rejoining Russia. All the infrastructure developments, economic developments. So. And then Venezuela, I was back in Canada at the time. This is before I had moved to Russia. So March 2019, I'd actually been in Venezuela in 2010, but just for personal reasons. In March 2019, the US was orchestrating or trying to orchestrate chaos in that country by attacking the power grid, hoping the country would descend into chaos. So I went there. I joined the US Peace Council for 4 or 5 days, and then I stayed on for another couple of weeks or so. And a similar thing, what the West was saying was absolutely not true. And in fact, the funniest thing was not only that Venezuelans were completely dispelling their narratives just by being calm and helping one another, but that when the West was trying to push Juan Guaido on Venezuelans, there might have been one big protest. I didn't see it. I went to the massive Maduro protest. But then the next week after that massive Maduro protest, I went around on a motorcycle taxi trying to find the Guaido protest. And I found like a handful in Altamira, and I forget all the place names now, but I literally found none in areas where it should have been an opposition strong region. I found a bunch of Chavistas or pro-Maduros marching from there to join the big march that was taking place. So it was pretty amusing in that regard, because the reality on the ground didn't match what the media were saying. So that's basically the commonalities that everywhere I've gone, yeah, you'll find people that are anti-Assad, anti-Putin, anti-Maduro, etc. But by and large, it hasn't been like the overwhelming majority.
Well, thank you for this explanation. Yes, go ahead.
May I jump in here? This was a fantastic introduction, by the way, and which basically englobed everything that at least in my channel, we discuss like every day. All the connectivities between Juan Guaido and whatever happens in Ukraine and Syria, and you name it, you're gonna see the fingerprints of the three-letter agencies or the powers that be at the moment. I just wanted to more talk to Brazilian people right now, which are going to watch this later. And you said something that is very important for people to understand, that you have a music background. You were not interested in geopolitics or politics whatsoever until a certain point. And I see here two different three, of course, but two different backgrounds, which is me, that I'm from Rio de Janeiro, and I was very used to the violence and the intervention that we kind of do not understand that's intervention, but it is through the drug cartels and all that. And you come from a country that, I live in Italy now, so I can kind of make a parallel with the reality of Europe. And the reality of Europe is probably more or less the same as the reality in Canada when it comes to, quality of life and all that. So this is one person that at some point just got tired of the violence and everything, and say, hey, I have to take care of my life. I'm probably going to have a children at some point, and I want a better situation, a better living situation. And you come from the better living situation, and at some point you got reality basically punching your face, and you're looking around and say, I cannot stand silent
Yeah.
anymore. And my case was a little later when the same thing that they were doing to Brazil came knocking in my door. So I said, I'm living in Italy. So the problems in Europe now are knocking in my door. And that was the moment I said, I cannot stay silent. And I have to say something, because Brazilian people will not understand whatever is going on. And they need to, and people have to. And it's this week, by chance, I'm having a full week of interventionism and modus operandi of how they play our minds on news, on journalism, and how they silent people. And I find it interesting because I have seen you. When Nina told me, oh, I have contact with Eva Bartlett, and I was like, oh, awesome. I saw her, I guess in Redacted and some other outlets, some other YouTube channels recently. And today I was a little everywhere, but I tried to, while I was driving around, I tried to put on YouTube some material to listen, and I could not find any recent material from you. It was all 10 years ago, 9 years ago, 5 years ago, We On or Indian outlet or some other places. And I was like, well, I saw her. I'm starting to pay attention to geopolitics for the last 2 years. And I saw her a lot of times talking about Ukraine, talking about Donbass, talking about Palestine and everything. Where is it? And this is extremely interesting. And I would like to ask you, this doesn't have to be a huge answer about that. But I would like to ask you, not exactly how do you feel, but how do you see they trying to silence you the way they do? And why are they so afraid of what you just have to say?
Let's see. Well, I'll start with Twitter X thingy. I think we all face it. Like it's supposed to be this bastion of free speech, and it isn't. Yeah, my numbers go up, but the interactions and retweets and comments and people seeing actually if I do original tweets, no, it's pretty bad. Like I don't dwell on it too much, but every so often I will put a tweet out saying like, like so and so just told me this is the first tweet they've seen in X number of months or years or whatever. So there's that on X. Whereas other accounts that kind of came out of nowhere can rise to millions of followers and interactions. So there's something going on there. I'm not a tech person. I don't know how that works. If it's a matter of buying followers or bot farms or troll farms or whatever it is, I don't know. But that's X. But and I mean, YouTube, Facebook, they all engage in censorship. Obviously, my YouTube channel was deleted by YouTube last October. I'd had it for initially I thought 15 years, but I think it was like 13 years. But whatever, I had a lot of content from the various places we've talked about. And it was deleted the day after I did a thread on Twitter detailing my experiences in Gaza and giving concrete examples of an argument that has been put forward about Gaza. And I was saying, well, this is my experience. And I could say that's actually not true in my experience. And I think my experience reflects reality. And so I did a detailed thread, and the next day my YouTube was gone. So I don't think it's about me, Eva Bartlett. I think it's just that I had this particular experience in Gaza, which not everybody has. And I was highlighting that at a time when it isn't allowed to talk honestly about matters Palestine, specifically Gaza. So I think that's why my YouTube was deleted. I did have a second one that I had forgotten about. It was from, a decade and a half ago. And I came across it. I think I was editing a blog post from something, and I was like, oh, I forgot I had this. So I was like, okay, I'll use this. And it had, I don't know, a handful of followers, maybe 50, maybe less. I thought I will use this to redirect people to other platforms. I don't trust YouTube. I'm not going to invest in it, but I will, if I can get it up to 500, because that's what I understood, then you could use the community section of YouTube. Then I can use this to point people to my Telegram or Odyssey or Rumble or whatever. So I did do that. And I also published some of my more recent videos on that YouTube. And then next thing I know, it's deleted. And it was like, yeah, it was some sort of hate speech, because I had the word KILL in it, referring to the famous Mirotvorets list. And so, and an interview I'd done, and the fact that I was put on it, back in 2019. Anyway, so that was deleted. So I'm, obviously done with, I still share YouTube, but anyway, back to your question. So I'm obviously not being censored exclusively. I have colleagues who've also had their channels deleted or content deleted. It boils down to controlling the narrative, right? And I know that you're very careful on trying to avoid having that censorship. And I appreciate, obviously you want to be able to reach people. But it just speaks to, here I am living in Russia, and you guys can probably speak to how many negative things are said about Russia, and like what that we can't say anything here, that we're so censored here, can't open our mouth, can't have a conversation. Well, in fact, I see people writing things critical of the government living in Russia, and writing things critical of the SMO, for example, still living in Russia. And in fact, there's quite a lot of diversity on RT, more than you would find in Western media. So back to your original question, it's like they just want to silence by any means possible, by intimidation, by slurs and name calling, or by deletion. And at the same time, it's just so ironic because the countries they say are the worst, the most oppressive, aren't doing that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. On this topic, I remember there was a campaign against you and a few other independent voices, specifically in the Canadian media. So I have the CBC article. You probably remember one of them from 2022. But the issue here is, I mean, they're criticizing you. They're criticizing certain people in Russia who attempted to bring evidence of how do I say it without getting pulled off of YouTube, evidence of very bad behavior by the Ukrainian army in Donbass before 2022, and how a lot of that was rejected. They talk about how the persecution of the Orthodox Church was fake, even though we're now living in 2024, and we've seen now it's been banned. So a lot of things that are being criticized it's kind of like a little time capsule, this article. They were, at least initially, brought up by some of these major human rights organizations that you referenced. Now, of course, with 2022, remember, Amnesty was really shut down in April when they tried to talk about some of the things that the Ukrainian army was doing that was not up to their standards, let's put it this way. And so it's really interesting how the things that this Canadian media article is saying are not true are well documented by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty back then, by a number of major organizations, and even Western mainstream media in the first couple of years actually it wasn't ideal, but it was much, much more accurate coverage compared to what we see today. So I thought this particular smear campaign against you and some other people in the Canadian media was very, very telling, because if you've been following this topic like me, you know that you can pull up things from these organizations that debunk the claims that are made there. And of course, their claim is that you're the one who is not, you and a number of other people are the ones who are, skewing the information, et cetera, et cetera. How did you feel? Yeah. Did you feel that the Canadian media went after you because you have this Canadian sort of background, or did you think you just happened to be there because of what you cover?
Actually, what happened was independent Canadian media, Maverick Media, had reached out to me in, I think it was May. And so, as I might have said earlier, in 2022, I was back and forth from my home in Moscow Oblast, which I'm renting, I don't own, to the Donbass. And so, as you know, 2022 was an extremely hard year in the Donbass. The center of Donetsk was constantly being bombarded. And I was witness to that. So I was documenting, unfortunately, the scenes of post-bombardment, bodies laying in the streets, etc. And also, you mentioned Human Rights Watch, and they did touch the issue of Mine Lepestok, the Petal mines, but they didn't do it they didn't address that issue in regards to Donetsk. They talked about other areas. So I was actually in Donetsk when the mines were fired in late July. And so the center of the city was littered with these things. And for people who don't know what they are, they're like the size of a cigarette lighter or lipstick or something. They're slightly hooked. They're also called butterfly mines. And they're so tiny that even when I was walking with some other journalists in the area of, well, I mean, it was all over Donetsk, but in the particular area we were at, very central Donetsk, and there were signs pointing at these things and I couldn't see them. And I was like, okay, there should be something there. There's a sign saying there's something and I can't see it. It took my eyes a long time to adjust to the thing that was right in front of me. So these things are exceptionally insidious because they blend in so well with the background, and they're generally not strong enough to render a person lifeless, but they will blow off feet and hands. I don't know now the number. I think it's well over 160 people who've been maimed, 3 killed. And so that's some of the things I was seeing. I was seeing the aftermath of the Ukrainian shelling. I was in a hotel that Ukraine shelled. And at the time the CBC did their little musical piece on me, because, this Justin Ling character, and he had some Tim Squirrel or something like that with one of these fancy institutes with their fancy charts and all that stuff. And they added scary music because I'm a really evil person, and they had to show how evil I am by adding the scary music. So at that point, they did their piece in June. So in May, Maverick had reached out to me. I'm not sure how they came across my name. And they interviewed me about Mirotvorets. And they said, we're really concerned. You're a Canadian journalist. You're on this list. And I said, well, yeah, I've been on it for a few years, whatever. But I mean, it is a serious matter. I'm not trying to shrug it off, but what can you do? But it is a serious matter for people who aren't aware. Those who are put on the list, as much information that is known about them, whether it's phone number, nationality, passport, address, is listed. And if there's a potential to get rid of those people, they are then marked liquidated with an X through them or something. So Maverick Media was concerned about this. And they did an interview with me. I spoke about what I've been seeing in Donbass, and Maverick, bless them, ended by saying, we're really concerned. We're going to reach out to Canadian media. I said, did I? And then a week or so later, I got an email from some CBC producer or whatever. And, this is 2022. I've been smeared by media since 2016, late 2016. So I'm kind of very familiar with their tactics. So when I see the email, I'm like, okay, I know what's going to happen here. So obviously I don't answer the email. I just made fun of it instead, because that's what I do. And I put it on social media. I'm like, okay, they're going to do a smear about me. And they did. But the interesting thing about that, the smear was completely unoriginal. It wasn't only about me. It was about other people who had participated in a panel in Moscow in March about whether Ukraine had committed terrible acts, let's say, in Donbass. And so I talked about my experience in 2019. Other people spoke. The person who organized it, I knew already from Syria. He's a very good researcher, a Russian man. But, we weren't in constant contact, and he certainly wasn't giving me directives. Here, Eva, this is what you need to. In fact, nobody gives me directives. I go there and something happens and I report on it. Maybe I go there with an idea that I want to interview so-and-so, but nobody gives me directives what I need to report on. So that's important to state in any regard of any reporting I've done. And so basically the CBC made it out to look like I was being puppeteered by this man who organized the panel, when in fact he brought together people who could speak about their experiences on Ukraine's actions in the Donbass. But the interesting thing I wanted to say was that in their smears, so they talked about me participating in this panel. It might seem like a minor detail. They said it was in April. It wasn't. It was in March. Maybe, I don't remember, March 11th. They said it was in April. But do you know where they got that information? They got that information from Mirotvorets, the listing on me. Yeah, so Maverick Media contacts them saying, we're concerned about this Canadian journalist. We're worried about her well-being. CBC then contacts me and doesn't say a word about Miraflores, and goes on to use information from the listing on me to do their smear. So that's just how how nasty the media is. I don't care about the smear, but it just shows all the complaining that journalists do. We're being persecuted in Canada. I don't know. I'm sure that happens, but like, here's the national media being made aware of a journalist potentially at risk of being offed. And instead of highlighting that, they go on to create the conditions where I could actually be offed in Canada. So
yeah, I'm looking at this article and it still hasn't been corrected. It's talking about the fact that this happened in April. So it's sort of the very basic fact checking that should have been done. And in the age of auto translate, it's not that difficult to access even Russian language media, but of course it had been covered in English by Russian language sources that also have a foreign presence. So it's kind of amazing. I mean, the obvious question would be, if they're wrong about this very obvious fact, the date, what else are they wrong about in this article? I think anyone with critical thinking skills hopefully asks questions like that, but I guess it's kind of hard to tell the extent of it.
In fact, I'll just add 2 more points. So one is they either included video footage of me participating in this panel or a screenshot. And that actually, I think it was a screenshot, and it traced back to, I can't remember which Russian website, which publicized the event. So they took the image from the Russian website, which publicized the event, which had the date, March, blah, 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 2022. And then they went on to do the thing. And the other point was, they wanted to portray me as absolutely bonkers, right? So they went through my then existing YouTube. And at that point, so this is June. So I had videos from 2019, from my first visit to the Donbass. I had videos from Mariupol from April. And then I had a lot of videos from Donetsk, from post-Ukrainian attacks on marketplaces and such. The only video that they chose to highlight was one English-speaking woman I encountered at a church in Mariupol during Easter then. So there was an Easter service in this church, and I met this woman just randomly, and she spoke English. I was like, brilliant, because my Russian was pretty non-existent at that point. It's better now. And so I was like, oh, great. So I don't have to add subtitles. Can I interview you? So it wasn't, again, I stress, this wasn't like the Kremlin gave me this woman and said, talk to her. It was a random encounter, and she spoke English. I was like, great. So she said something like, we need to get rid of these people. I'm paraphrasing, something like that. We need to get rid of, not kill, but we need to have to stop coexisting with these people who are oppressing us. And I said, she said, these crazy people. I said, who are they? She said, some call them Nazis, right? And that's the video CBC chose to make me look as though I'm crazy now. As you rightly said, Nina, prior to 2022, you can find Ottawa Citizen, National Post, maybe
BBC,
even
multiple reports from the BBC that are still up and accessible.
Yeah, talking about
on YouTube, yes, of all places.
There's a National Post article talking about Canada meeting with and training these Azov factions, right? So it's like you said, they try to, like, it's just so easy to refute what they were trying to do. They're trying to make me look crazy. Okay, maybe some people believed it, people with the intelligence of a 5-year-old, maybe, but all these facts are out there. So
this is my little tinfoil hat theory, is that they changed the spelling of Kiev to sort of scrub the internet without having to scrub it, because people these days would be Googling Kiev with a Y instead of Kiev with an I, and maybe certain articles would not come up. I know it's like a tinfoil hat level theory, but it is a theory. So, and yeah, looking at the website to address the photograph, there's a video that, I'm not going to click on right now, but the photograph is from the Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation. So that's an legitimate body. And yes, like you're saying, if you're citing it in English, why did you not go through the trouble of very, very, very basic fact checking beyond any kind of political interpretation? It's just really kind of sad. But I'd like to jump back to the question of, from my perspective, when you introduced yourself, you seem to talk about Syria as the first place where you sort of started really analyzing the difference between corporate media coverage in the West versus what you were seeing on the ground, talking to people, traveling to different places. So was it in fact Syria, or was it your first trips to Palestine? Because you said you also listened to this Canadian news station initially as your introduction to politics. Was that the first time, or was it specifically Syria? Was it kind of like a gradual process where things started clicking eventually?
I would say Syria, but also to a degree, a gradual process. So when I lived in Gaza, I remember thinking like one day maybe I could get my articles in the Guardian. Not because I was a careerist. I've never been a careerist, but I just thought like at that time I was still naive enough to think they reported honestly. So I thought, because there were some good articles back then. So I thought like, well, if I can get there, then it will reach more people. So that was me being naive. And also I didn't understand how media worked. So I started gradually during my years in Gaza. I started to realize, wait a second, like why, okay, so in 2009, CBC interviewed me. And when they rang me up, they said something like, we would like to interview you next week. And I remember saying something like, why not now? I'm here right now. Because, I was going back and forth from northern Gaza, where I was with the paramedics in their ambulances, to one of the functioning media buildings, which, by the way, was bombed at one point when I was in it. I was giving an interview to RT of all channels. It was my first interaction with RT, and it was shelled, I forget, 7 or so times by tank shelling. And we scrambled down from the 12th floor, I think it was, down to the ground. Anyway, it wasn't, I think when I was replying to CBC, I was making the point, people need to hear, well, at least what I'm saying now. Why wait another week? But the reason they waited another week, and I didn't know it at the time, was that they wanted to have a balanced interview and they wanted to have a Canadian on the other side. It didn't work out to be balanced because that person gave an interview where he was basically talking about sunbathing and drinks and stuff. And I was talking about nowhere was safe and no bomb shelters. So, but, I didn't know that at the time. In 2012, they actually interviewed me again during the November war. And I was in central Gaza at that time. And after that, of course, they never reached out to me. So I started gradually to understand they wouldn't, because they have a narrative to sell, and things I was saying didn't meet their narrative. But it was in Syria. Yeah, before I went to Syria, I was actually more aware, finally, of how the media worked. But then, again, as I think I said earlier, like I would be in somewhere like Aleppo, and I'd be seeing one reality, and then they'd be reporting a different reality. Or like if you go to Syria, I used to say, if you spend 5 minutes there. So I do speak Arabic, colloquial Arabic, not classical Arabic. So I can interact with the people, and you spend just a little bit of time there. And unless you're in a really sectarian area that's been, mind warped by the Gulf states, most people will say they love and respect their president. It's just a fact. It doesn't mean you have to, but it's just a fact. And so, the combination of the way the media was saying this is a civil war and it was Sunni versus Shia and all that stuff, that wasn't the truth. And in fact, Aleppo was a prime example of that, because it was, I don't know the percentage, let's say 90% Sunni Islam in Aleppo. And they rejected what the West was calling a revolution. They didn't want any part of it. It was hurled upon them. So I was seeing, Aleppo, which I went to 4 times in 2016 before it was liberated, and it was being shelled just like Damascus was. And then I was in the States. I was in New York at the end of 2016 doing I don't remember how many cities speaking tour, talking about what I'd seen. And, I don't like watching television, but their TVs were on. There was CNN or Fox talking about how Aleppo fell. And I was just like, you're crazy. You have no idea. Like literally people there are being oppressed by Al-Qaeda. They're being bombarded and all these nasty things that I will not say, but you can imagine, by these different factions. And they actually, contrary to the media reporting, they had endured long months and months of starvation and siege due to these factions. And finally, women could walk in the streets, people could walk in the streets without fear of being sniped or otherwise. And yet Western media was saying it fell. And they just went on and the other thing was they kept pushing this narrative that it was a peaceful protest and peaceful revolution, and it wasn't. When I first went there, I was hearing narratives from people, like some people who became friends, and they said, with the initial protests, we went out because we wanted certain political changes. And so they're not afraid to say that, and they don't get in trouble for saying that, but they didn't want the toppling of their president. And yet the West kept pushing this narrative that the Syrians did want the toppling of their president and that the protests were peaceful, and they weren't from the very beginning. So it was the contrast of actually being there and hearing what people were saying, living it, experiencing it myself, the shelling from Eastern Ghouta and elsewhere. And for example, Lise Doucet, Canadian journalist who works with the BBC, she, I don't know how many times she's been there, but she was there in April 2014 when I was first there. And the factions in Eastern Ghouta had shelled the old city of Damascus, like they always were. They shelled a school, injuring, I think one child was killed and 60 were injured. And so in one of the hospitals treating the children, I was taking footage, and there was Lise Doucet, and she was challenged by Syrian, or she Palestinian Lebanese nun, but spent a lot of time in Syria, Mother Agnes Mariam, who was asking her, are you going to report honestly? And Lise was like, yeah. And then she went on to write a very dishonest article for the BBC. And she said, well, we saw children injured. And, the regime says it's rebels in Eastern Ghouta, but locals believe it's the regime. Okay, first of all, anybody who spent time there knew exactly where those mortars were coming from. And I'm not a weapons person in spite of spending so much time in war zones, but you can find somebody who can tell you about the point of impact of that mortar or shell, and then the size of the tail or whatever, what distance it could have flown, and the point of impact tells you from where it's come. So we knew it was coming from Eastern Ghouta, and she was lying through her teeth, but that was to meet the narrative that the Western media was spinning. So back to your question, yeah, it was I think I was starting to understand before I went to Syria, but then I was completely solidified once I was there.
That's kind of a harsh reality way to I guess develop that kind of understanding. And I've never been to Donbass, but seeing coverage since 2014, you have a very similar situation with people on the ground who live there, who live in small towns, saying exactly where this particular shell came from. They're so used to hearing them. There's sort of a certain level of desensitization, unfortunately. And the way that the media in the West would then report on it was very, very much contradictory, because the people there who live there knew exactly who was shooting at them. And then, of course, you also have a lot of passive voice headlines like bombs fell, children died, but there's no culprit mentioned if it challenges the dominant narrative. So I think once you're sort of tuned into these little tricks of manipulating language, even though technically it's not incorrect, it's just, censorship through omission and manipulation through omission and using a particular type of voice instead of the active voice, then you really sort of get to understand what's going on. Marcelo, let's have you ask the question, and then I have another question.
No, it's not. It's just a jump in to phrase that, as she mentioned about RT. I have never been to RT or mainstream media, but I've been giving some interviews in the Iranian TV, and they basically write to me like, I don't know, perhaps in the best case scenario, 4 hours before. We're going to be there in 4 hours. And they go in when God decides, and they never tell you anything. Perhaps they're going to tell you, we are going to talk about this subject, and just the subject. And you go live, you have no idea what the questions are going to be. You have no idea. You have not talked to anyone about that. And that's it. And as you mentioned, we had Larry Johnson. Larry Johnson was here yesterday as well on my channel. And this last week, he also talked about this in several outlets like Judge Napolitana and also in RT, if I'm not mistaken. And he confirmed the same thing. These outlets, they call you. We're going to do an interview. This is the subject. We will not combine anything beforehand. And I'm not a big shot to give huge interviews. Just these cases. And that's basically it. Just so people understand that, that's the tyrant, what's it called, regimes. they don't ask you questions. They don't tell you what to say. They just leave you, yeah, just say whatever you have to say when I ask. And, that's it. While the beautiful democracy, I don't have to complete the phrase. I think everybody understood. I just wanted to jump in to, reinforce what you just said. I think it's important people to understand.
Mhm.
And of course, RT is now sanctioned, so I know that some people who live in the West are afraid to collaborate, even though they're not even employees. They're just contributors who are probably not even getting paid. But I know that because of these recent sanctions, it seems like they're no longer going on the channel. But let's go back to your very vivid description of Aleppo, and you've also been to Mariupol. I'm wondering whether you see any parallels between the two cases, both in what the civilians were going through, the military operation, urban warfare, and also media coverage. Because on the surface, it seems like these are two different conflicts. But I think once you start digging deeper, I wonder whether you think there might be some things that are similar, or are they actually different?
No, there's very many parallels. So if we look at the media coverage, for example, like the Western media would say the Syrian quote unquote regime destroyed Aleppo, when in fact, when I was there, and so I went there 3 times on my own and once with a delegation. And the only reason I joined the delegation was because it was bloody expensive to go. It was $100 each way, and I had very little money. And by the way, I didn't stress this before, but nobody was paying for me to go to any of these places, Palestine or Syria, etc. So I was pretty low on money, and there was an option to join a media delegation. I already had permissions, because in Syria you do have to apply for permissions to go to places that are high risk. And I had the permissions at the time that this delegation was going, but I was like, well, if I can get a free ride, why not? And plus I can see what they say about what we all see, right? And so that was really interesting. What was my point with that? My point with that was that yes, it was during that delegation that one of the journalists, so we went to it was supposed to be a humanitarian crossing. So yeah, I'm sure you're aware that in whether it was Aleppo or Eastern Ghouta, Syria and Russia combined tried to open humanitarian crossings in order to allow civilians to flee the area in which Al-Qaeda and other terrorist gangs were, what's the word I was looking for? Not residing. I'm looking for a stronger word.
Operating.
Occupying.
Yes.
Usually civilians weren't able to flee. There were cases when they could, but usually what happened was that the terrorist groups within would fire upon shelling or machine gun fire on the crossing and make it impossible. So this group of journalists I was with, we were taken to one of these crossings, and it was the same thing. And in fact, we were taken to 2 different crossings. At the first one of the journalists, it might have been Ann Barnard of the New York Times, I don't remember which one, but they basically asked the Syrian, whatever his rank was, general, something like, why don't you just bomb all of there and get rid of them? I think it was a loaded question. I think they were trying to incriminate, but the general replied something to the effect, and I heard this many, many times: we can't, because there are civilians inside there. There are people inside there. Yes, we want to eradicate Al-Qaeda, but our people are there. So we can't just carpet bomb like America did Raqqa. And so that was a theme I'd hear over and over again in Syria. And although I wasn't there from the beginning of fighting in Mariupol, I was there in April. The Azovstal was still ongoing. We were about 1 kilometer away. And the people that we were meeting, they were talking about, and we've heard ample of these testimonies since then. They were speaking about how they were either in the basements or first floor apartments, and Ukrainian forces had taken over upper apartments. So the parallel in this would be both that actually Russia exercised extreme restraint when they were fighting in Mariupol. They didn't flatten Mariupol, as contrary to what the Guardian said. They didn't level Mariupol. There's strategic fighting against areas where Ukrainian forces were occupying, whether it was in schools, whether it was in the upper floor of apartments or Azovstal, etc. But what Western media didn't report, just like they didn't report on the terrorists in eastern Aleppo shelling greater Aleppo and killing like almost 11,000 civilians before Aleppo was liberated, Western media also didn't report on Ukrainian forces both holding civilians as human shields effectively when they occupied these upper floors, but also there were many instances in which they fired themselves, the Ukrainian forces, on these buildings. So when I was there in April 2022, I didn't know Mariupol. I hadn't been there before. I didn't know the layout of the city, so I couldn't orient myself until subsequent visits throughout 2022 and then 23 and this past May. But what I saw now when I was back there in May, but also when I was back there in May, I was able to walk around because I was just on my own and I didn't have wheels. So I was walking everywhere in the center of the city. And then I looked back at my footage from 2022, April and onwards, and I was like, okay, now I understand where I was. And it was the key axes of the city. It was Prospect Mira and correct my pronunciation, Metallurgica, or the other main
Metallurgist, probably the street or an avenue, Metallurgist. Yeah,
that one. And they're the ones that meet in the center, and then you would have the drama theater there, the very center of the city, that beautiful church. And so I was with RT. I joined RT in April. I wasn't working with them, but I joined them, and they very kindly said, you can come with us. And so that was my transportation and my translation. And so they were the journalist I was with. He was doing humanitarian runs, taking food to the people who had been stuck in these basements or first floors. And so that's how I was able to see those areas. So when I look back at the footage, I'm like, okay, now I know the city better. I know exactly, maybe not the sub-districts, but I know the street we went up. And I look at the footage. Yes, there was destruction here, but these buildings are intact. Yes, look, there's upper floor destruction here. These buildings are intact, And so basically what I'm saying is the buildings that had some destruction or were destroyed, where the Ukrainian forces were. The way the Western media portrayed it was that Russia just went in with a sledgehammer and bombarded everything and destroyed everything. That wasn't the case, because even referring to a Guardian article, I think in 2023, that I only in recent months came across, they're saying the entire center of the city was leveled. And that absolutely wasn't true. I was there, I saw it, and I actually have footage to prove it. So that's a parallel, is that this reporting by omission, as you said before, so omission of what the terrorist in Aleppo did. I sometimes mix the two up now. What the terrorists in Aleppo did, or in Eastern Ghouta, or putting all the blame on the Syrian government or the Russian government, and just removing any blame from these Ukrainian forces and Azov. But there's so many people that were Russian journalists, foreign journalists like Christelle Niant, who was going there repeatedly and taking testimonies. There's so much testimony now of what happened in Mariupol. It's impossible. You have to be lying if you adhere to the Western version of things, that Russia deliberately destroyed the entire city. That wasn't the fact. And in fact, so many testimonies to the contrary, that Russia, just like it has taken its time in other areas, was being very careful in how they were fighting the Ukrainian forces. So I would say those are the main parallels. And also, there's been so much rebuilding in Mariupol since then. Even in September and October, November, when I was going back there, you would already see, like, for example, the main road from Donetsk to Mariupol. I think it was by September, maybe November, that was already repaved. And that was amazing, because the road in April when we went, it was like, I say, when you got back, it felt like you'd been put through a washing machine. It was so bumpy, and you had to go under bridges, etc., to get around just to get there. But by September or November, it was repaved, and there was already cleaning up and rebuilding starting at that time. In November, I think it was, or September, I went to see, the big, massive complex of white apartment buildings, like 3,000 housing units. That was already being built September or October, I forget the date exactly, 2022. And since then, there's been so much rebuilding. And in my last trip there in May, I couldn't tell, I think a lot of what I was seeing was actually just renovation, not rebuilding, because that's a common theme, is that under Ukraine, nothing was being renovated. So I was just walking around, and I intended to go to this one particular spot, maybe a 20-minute walk from the center of the city. where I had read online on a Telegram there was 3 new apartments. So I was like, okay, I'll go check them out. And as I was walking, I kept stopping because everywhere was being renovated. And I was like, oh, I got to film that. I got to film that. So it's just, this theme that the Western media is still putting out, that Mariupol is occupied, just like they did with Aleppo, and that life hasn't improved. And in fact, when I was back in Aleppo in 2020, 2021 also, no, 2020, it was night and day. Like there's still a lot of rebuilding, but there was so much life in the streets and around the historic citadel, and it's just like a feeling of a pulse of life that you wouldn't have in both regards when Ukraine and that the Ukrainian forces in Azov were there, or in Aleppo and other areas when the Western-backed terrorists were there.
Thank you for that. And I think it's really great that you're giving really specific examples, which I think is one of the reasons that you've been censored, where it's not just a general statement about, Russia good or Syria good, the Syrian government. You're giving very, very specific examples. And of course, a lot of them you've experienced yourself. And regarding Mariupol, I think it's important to mention that some of these testimonials have been translated into English, so they are accessible to a broader audience. And it's specific individuals describing their stories. I remember posting them on Twitter/X many months ago. So, we can bring this up for those who are interested. And I also saw these bird's eye view shots of Mariupol from, I guess it must have been spring, where the church that you mentioned was very much intact. And I was really happy to see that. But now that you put it in context, that it was very particular buildings that were targeted, it makes a lot more sense why a church would be standing, but a building not too far away would be damaged, because as you said, human shields were, the human shield tactic was being employed there. But I'd like to go back again to the beginning, and I'm curious, as someone who was coming from an arts background, how did you develop your methodology on reporting? What were you using to document initially? What are you using to document now in terms of filming, writing things down, etc.? Again, was this kind of a process, sort of learning on the spot? How did you develop this approach to your work?
I have to think about that. So I did mention that before I got at all political, I did a lot of traveling, and I've always liked writing. I've always kept a journal. So whenever I've traveled, I've kept a journal, and I just, I guess the journaling aspect while traveling was kind of helpful in terms of like then going on to start writing. Because I sometimes when I look back at these journals, I read the description of what I wrote, and I feel like, bang, I'm back there in Scotland or wherever. So I think that was one component, was that I always enjoyed detailing things in writing. When I went to the West Bank, as I said, I opened a blog, and I look back at my early writing and I'm kind of like cringe, because it was pretty amateur, but it was just a work in progress. So I think a combination of my habit of liking to write things down, and then realizing I'm somewhere that I really want it to be, and I want to express what the people I'm meeting have to say, or what they've endured, or what I'm seeing. So what did I have in terms of documentation? That was 2007. I would have had like an old Nokia as a phone, so not a smartphone. I had some sort of what's it smart no what's it called simple point and shoot camera.
Yeah, point and shoot.
Yeah, probably a Canon or something like that. So I had a simple camera. I don't even remember if it was like a memory card, but anyway, very simple camera. I didn't have any professional equipment. I had an old banger of a laptop. So basically I haven't developed a whole lot more in terms of technology. I did invest in a relatively good amateur SLR camera, but I learned that actually just taking my mobile is a lot easier. It saves space, easier to whip out and film things. As far as the writing, it's at one point I was editing a lot someone else's writing, so I was restructuring very poorly written from somebody, an Arabic speaking journalist, restructuring what he meant to say. So that was helpful as well in learning how to be a better writer. And then just, I don't know, just learning as I went. For me, I feel like I think I'm more understated. It's my preferred style. I feel like because I've seen speakers or pieces where there's too much drama. And I guess I've learned, just if I just state the simple facts, it's often powerful enough. And in fact, like when I used to give lectures in the West, I would just matter of fact show photos or videos and say, this is what happened, this is what happened. And oftentimes at the end of the lecture, people would be crying and say, like, how can you just say that so matter of fact? And I realized at that point that had more impact than being, overly dramatic. So I guess that's kind of how it's evolved. I mean, when I was
Were
first
you
writing,
were you initially recording the interviews before the age of smartphones? Did you have some kind of a recording device, or did you literally write things down like old
I
school?
wrote old school, wrote things down. Yeah. I mean, I start later on recording. I think at one point I did buy a voice recorder thing. And then of course, then we could just use our phones. So that wasn't necessary. But no, initially it was old school, writing things down. And during the 2008-9 war on Gaza, it was definitely a lot of writing things down, because at that point I had a laptop whose battery lasted like 2 seconds or whatever. So I definitely depended on electricity. And I remember the night of the land invasion. So it was, I forget the date, in early January. I was with Palestinian Red Crescent medics. We had been out in ambulances, and we were back in the Red Crescent station in eastern Jabalia. So it was the area, Esbet Abu Rabba was one of the areas that always got invaded first. So we basically stayed there with the shelling very close around us, the power out. And I remember dictating over the phone to somebody who I knew, who's in the West Bank, an article I'd written on a, I don't know, a notepad or whatever. So I dictated it to him. He typed it out and published it. So that's how I did it at that point. Otherwise, then I would keep a notebook, and then I would divide my time between riding with the medics and going back to Gaza City to this one media building that I knew had both electricity and internet, and then type up my notes and just post stuff and then go back out.
Do you find writing or video to be more impactful now that it's easier to present actual moving images, or does it really depend on the context?
I guess in this day and age, video is more impactful. I guess I'm still more old school in that I don't really do the selfie video reporting. I prefer to just point the camera at the thing that I'm reporting on. That said, there was it was probably September 2022 in Donetsk. That was really hard. In the space of 5 days, the Ukrainian shelling on 3 different occasions killed, was it 26 people? And so I was seeing their remains on the streets and sidewalks. And so at the second place I went to and I filmed, and it was a ghastly scene where you couldn't even identify what belonged to what. And I blurred the images, and I made a video with voiceover when I got back to the apartment I was renting. And then some Muppet somewhere in, I don't know, California or New York or something. I wasn't following him, but just people kept sending me this video, and they're saying like, oh, he's saying you're lying because the people are wearing clothes that don't accord with the weather, the temperature that he thinks it is. So he's like, because they're wearing jackets that I wasn't wearing, that means that these are all crisis actors and you're lying. So I was like, oh my goodness, this is ridiculous. And so then the next time Ukraine shelled right near the Central Market in Donetsk, and I went there and I had body armor on and I filmed, and it was a horrible scene. And then I turned the camera around on myself and I said some words just to say, like, yeah, this is really happening. This is a real thing. That woman screaming over there is really in panic and grief, so, but generally I prefer, like, I don't like to put the camera on myself because I don't think it's necessary. But I guess at some point, in order to establish you're there and this is the date and time, I can see the relevance in doing that. But then I prefer to just have it on the person or people who, you're talking about. But I think, I don't know, I think back to your question, I guess it depends who your audience is. Some people prefer to read. Some people, maybe the younger generation prefers the videos. So it's, I guess, a fine balance. But I like to mix both. Like I like to include, obviously clips that I've done in a longer form article as well.
That's really interesting because you seem to be very consistent. In the beginning of this conversation, you said that your initial blog was anonymous, not because you wanted to conceal who you are, but because you didn't think who you are was important to what you were reporting on. And now you're saying the only reason you're, having to film yourself is to basically prove that, yes, I am on the ground. This is really me. This is not a crisis actor whose, body parts are thrown about the central market. So it really does show this trajectory of this is sort of a necessity as opposed to I am trying to become this maybe cloud chaser because I'm always in these zones and that gets gives me more attention. So that seems to be a very consistent trajectory for you. Yes, Marcelo, jump in.
Plus, just want to mention it's very unfair situation because you are filming reality, and as you just mentioned, there's some people screaming of pain. Perhaps the legs are off or whatever, and you're not going to get your microphone and go there. Hey, are you suffering? And at the same time, the propaganda outlets, when they do this, this show up of lies, they do that. Oh, see, these people is suffering. Are you suffering? Yes, I am suffering with all this ketchup in my face, all that kind of stuff. It's an unfair fight.
Yeah.
I mean, you just showing the image should be enough. Apparently, it's not anymore. Sorry, I just want to
Yeah.
jumping on that.
Well, when Eva was covering this, I remember that footage, and I remember what the Western media was saying, and they were using exactly the same language they would do with Syria and other places. They would say Russia claims that Kiev shelled the center of Donetsk, but we can't really prove it because we're not there. Of course, when it was the other side, it was unquestionable, not even mentioned where the information is coming from. So that was a very interesting trajectory to compare that versus people who are literally showing you what happened. And, and it's so horrible that you're having to blur it. And that was going to be my next question. How
just a second, just before you enter that, just Monday I had a conversation with another Canadian, which is Robert Fantina, and we were talking about exactly the thumbnail had the image of that CNN reporter on Syria, chemical attack or whatever, with a backpack sniffing it and saying, yeah, it smells like chemical attack.
It smells like chemical weapons. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yep. Breathe in those chemicals, Arwa. Arwa Daman.
Those chemicals.
Yeah.
It reminds me, that level of coverage is much like that whole British Novichok story with poisonings that never actually poison the people and they're deadly. And again, walking around and sniffing the evidence like it's nothing. It's just kind of remarkable. It's, not even Hollywood level production, and somehow we're expected to fall for it. So you keep coming across these atrocities. Is it ever possible to get used to seeing it? Do you develop a certain level of desensitization because you've been exposed to, covering these types of scenes for, a long time now? Or is it more than shocking every single time? Or maybe perhaps the first time was the most shocking?
No, it continues to be shocking. When I nodded my head at desensitization, it's what I meant was that at the time you develop an ability to do what's necessary in terms of filming and getting information, but it always hits you. At least it always hits me. Definitely. If I talk about it too much, I'll probably get emotional. But no, it definitely does affect you. So I remember the first time. Wasn't the first time I saw a dead body in Gaza. So before the war started on December 27th, 2008. Of course, Israel was bombing prior to that. So I had taken testimonies. Maybe I hadn't seen a dead body at that point. So anyway, after the war started and we started volunteering with the paramedics. And so I was somewhere in northern Gaza. And so the paramedics were picking up the remains of a body and the person's face had imploded and I started sobbing. And this medic, a really lovely man, Arfa Abdul Dayam, he was so lovely, but he basically said to me, I guess he must have spoken English because my Arabic wasn't that strong at this point. He said to me, if you're going to work with us, you can't cry. And he wasn't being a dick. He was just saying, like, you have to get yourself together. And so I learned to compartmentalize that. But I still felt, the horror of it. And I mean, because it's not only, it's everything. All your senses are interpreting it. You're smelling it, you're hearing it. And I did learn to compartmentalize and then later let the emotions out. But I remember in 2012 in central Gaza at the, I think it was the Quds hospital. I can't remember. And again, I'd seen so many dead bodies by that point, but this boy was brought in, a teenage 14-year-old, I think his name was Nidal, and his whole body was like spaghetti, and his face was studded with shrapnel. And I just started sobbing. I shouldn't have, but I did. So it does get to you, obviously. But yeah, I guess that's to your question. Yeah, like even in Donetsk, like, years after Gaza and Syria, because I saw a lot of maimed and dead bodies in Syria as well. But even in Donetsk, I remember, I can't remember which particular, well, no, every time. Like the times in September were especially hard because it was just, like I said earlier, just horrific scenes and smells. But there, even it doesn't even have to be something that ghastly. It's knowing. So that in August, when Ukrainian forces, they were shelling the funeral of a commander from Gorlovka on August 4th, Olga Kachura or something like that.
Yes,
and,
I remember.
And the shelling started in front of the Donetsk Opera Theater, I think it is, which was basically 200 meters roughly from Donbass Palace, where a lot of the journalists were staying. And I usually was renting a discreet apartment, but at that point I was actually staying there to be near the journalists because this is a very busy time in terms of the Ukrainian shelling, so it was better to be near them so I could go out with them. And so that shelling, which started there, led up to the hotel. The last shell landed right outside the hotel and killed a woman that was walking by. And anyway, that day, I think it was 6 people were killed. And there were some, obviously horrific scenes from the pedestrian walkway. I'm totally blanking in the name, just a couple blocks over. And later you learned that there was a little ballerina. She was, an aspiring ballerina. She was due to go to St. Petersburg to study. She was killed in the shelling. Her grandmother was killed, and her ballet teacher, who was a former star ballerina herself, was killed. And so you see these anguish scenes of, I think the husband of the grandmother, or the husband of I think it was the husband of the grandmother, shrieking at the sight of his granddaughter who's torn to pieces. So even if you're not directly seeing it, like I saw the woman outside the hotel, but when you learn of these stories, it's still obviously like very traumatic because it's so emotional. And yeah, so it does still affect. I don't think there's that many people that wouldn't be affected by it. If they aren't, then I guess, I don't know. I don't really know how to explain it.
Well, some kind of abnormal psychology probably would be at play, because I mean, especially now with the proliferation of everyone using their smartphones and dumping content on social media. I mean, some of the stuff we see is, horrors beyond comprehension. You can't even, like, your imagination is not capable of imagining the things that are real and that are shown to us on a daily basis. And
Yeah.
so, and of course, ultimately, it's important to understand, even though it's awful to look at. So is there a single most dangerous situation that you've been in that you can point to, or is it sort of numerous situations and numerous conflict zones? Is there something that really sticks out in your mind where you really felt, just scared for your life?
I mean, I would say Gaza is the most dangerous place I've been because there is nowhere to flee. There aren't bomb shelters. Even I don't even remember basements, to be honest. One basement I remember, a family that I stayed with during the initial bombings. I stayed with them to lend moral support, and the next morning there was a big crater like 30 meters outside the house. But I mean, in Gaza, it's an exceptional situation because at any point you could be drone struck, F-16, et cetera, et cetera. And even when it isn't a time of war, being with the farmers and having the Israeli soldiers shooting, live ammunition within meters of our head and body, and just standing there, not doing the fight or flight thing, just standing there because you've made a conscious choice to stand in solidarity with these farmers or these people in these regions. So it's definitely messing with your mind, because it's not healthy to stand there and have these bullets fly past you. So that was a very dangerous situation. And at any point, they could have actually killed us. So I would say Gaza is the most dangerous, but there were times in Syria as well. I mean, once outside the walls of the old city in summer 2014, I was just standing with a friend, and there were a bunch of other Syrians around, and we were leaning against the wall in the shade because it was very hot. And a sniper from Jober, from Eastern Ghouta, fired towards us about 4 rounds. And so whereas I was accustomed to that in Gaza, when you're not mentally prepared for it, it's like, what? So that could have been, but I mean, it's just, I think everything combined. Gaza was the most extreme, but then there have been dangerous situations both in Syria and Donbass as well. I mean, when they shelled outside the Donbass Palace, so that morning I had been working in the lobby, sitting exactly where the windows were blown out. Later on, 10 minutes before that happened, I had been sitting there. I left because the music annoyed me. I went up to my room. I was working and the shelling started, and I realized the room was facing the direction the shelling was coming from, so I better get out of the room. And I went down to the lobby, was talking with journalists. The 4th bomb landed, and then because of all the coffee I'd had, I needed to visit the restroom. And that's when I literally just left the lobby, and that's when the last one that blew all the windows in landed. So, there are retrospective times like, oh, that could have been very bad. So it's a hard question to answer because it's been a lot of years.
There's been so many. Yeah. So beyond the possible mental preparation and wearing a protective vest, what other ways do you use to try to stay as safe as possible and actually, continue providing us with coverage as safely as possible?
So I didn't actually have the protective vest until Donbass, but in 2022, because it was being so heavily shelled, I started because I walk, most of the time I was walking everywhere if I was in the city. And so I did start mentally thinking, okay, they are over there to the west and to the north. So I'm not going to walk on the east side of the street. Is that right? Yeah. I'm not going to walk on the east side of the street or the south if I can avoid it. So I would try to flank the sides of buildings where if there was a shell to come to land, it wouldn't directly strike me. Maybe there'd be shrapnel from that direction. So I realized I started doing that. That was one thing. Gosh, I'm trying to think of other examples. It's hard to say because if for example, going to Gorlovka or Zaitsevo or the villages around, when I went back there, what month was that? September, I think. I don't remember, 2022. And I was with other journalists, and we had a taxi from Donetsk, but then we went to Gorlovka and we picked up someone from the municipality, and the car was too small for everybody. So it was either leave Nikita, a lovely Russian journalist who was martyred some months ago, I was either leave him behind or leave somebody else behind. So we decided we'd leave the driver behind, and I drove. And so that was very interesting because I learned on stick shift, so that was fine. But then I was still cognizant of the fact we're going to Zaitsevo. The roads there are a horrible mess, so you have to zigzag around the potholes. They're so bad. And so I'm driving, zigzagging, trying to listen and understand what's being said, and cognizant that the shelling could happen at any time. But that's just a situation where, you don't know if it's going to happen. You can either stay back and just not go, period, or you risk it happening and then deal with it when it does happen. So I don't know. There's not really that many safety measures you could take. What I did do was I took an emergency first aid course so that I learned the basics of using, now what's the word in English? What's the word in Russian?
Tourniquet.
A tourniquet, yeah.
Tourniquet, yeah.
Yeah, so there's different types of tourniquets, but there's a basic stretchy plastic one that I used to carry on the front of my body armor, so that if I or somebody else was injured, I could at least put that around, their arm or leg and try to cut off the flow of blood and keep them from bleeding out. That was one thing. That was one preventative thing I did. Yeah.
So when you initially started going to these conflict zones, what was the reaction from your friends and family?
They were concerned, but they didn't tell me not to go.
So
And
they
I got,
understood the drive sort of behind wanting to
yeah,
experience that firsthand and let the world know, basically. Yeah. Okay.
they did. But when I came back from the West Bank at the end of 2007, I think my dad did say something like, "Hey, you might be more effective if you stayed here and did stuff on the ground here." And I understood what he was doing, but I also said, well, I'm not really an organizer. There are people, that's their role, and they're really good at it. And I guess I realized I was okay at going to places and reporting what I was seeing. So he never told me not to go, but I knew he was very concerned about me, obviously. But yeah,
Yeah,
I was.
it's interesting. I'm glad they didn't intervene actively, or else we would not be seeing all your reporting had there been more of a pushback. Is there the story that you just told about the ballerina who died in the shelling was very vivid. It's just the way you describe it. I can picture it in my mind. Is there a particular story, one story, or perhaps a number of stories from all the places you've been to that you keep coming back to, maybe keep reevaluating or keep imagining that really, got to you in some way? I know it's a
Yeah.
difficult question because you.
Actually, no. There is one. When you said, so I was thinking there's so many stories, but when you said got to me in some way, yeah, the medic I mentioned, Arafa, so the one that told me not to cry, and he was a lovely man. He was very funny and goofy and very courageous. He actually was a volunteer medic. He was a high school, maybe science teacher. I'm not 100% sure, but it's a high school teacher by profession, and he volunteered for like a decade as a medic. And so one night, I don't remember, early January, one of the nights, we went to a high school that had been bombed, and we went there to see if we could, if anybody needed saving or retrieve remains. But it was, they have bare bones ambulances, and the headlights, they didn't have proper searchlights. So we're driving in northern Gaza, very dangerous, with drones and F-16s overhead, going to a place that has just been F-16'd, and we don't have proper search equipment, and the roads are like have been bombed, so the roads are rutted. And so we're driving, and I have some footage, not a lot of it, but I have some footage of driving along this fence, and like we eventually reach a point where we realize we can't go any further, we can't see anything, we can't do anything. So we wait and we go back at dawn. And at dawn, we go back to the same point. There's a massive crater in the road, which we couldn't have gotten past. They park the ambulance, and we go by foot. Arafa, I think two other medics, and I wasn't carrying the stretcher or anything. I was just documenting. And we go, and they find the remains of the late teen night watchman who'd been in the school, been killed. They retrieve his remains, and it's a very anyway, the scene is like, it's a school. There's a playground here. There's like a child's notebook on the ground. Everything's been bombed. There's the remains of this person, this teenager, and they carry him back to the ambulance. And the ambulance has a flat tire, and there's F-16s and drones overhead, and they're scrambling. Oh yeah. So they put as they carry the body. I remember we passed a child who was probably like, I don't know, hard to tell how old he was, maybe 6, 7, or 8. And one thing that disturbed me was he was just standing there watching. It was so normal for him. And I think he had a piece of bread in his hand. And he was just kind of chewing on the bread and watching this. And it's not a judgment of him. It's just the fact that this is, become so normalized for him. And kids, they'd be like, they'd know from the sound where there was an F-16 or, what kind of warplanes. That's obviously just disturbing. But that's not the thing that got me. It was that after we left that scene, then we went to, whatever hospital morgue and dropped the body off. And then I went back to Gaza City, because I said to you, I was dividing my time. I would see some things, have experiences, document things, and I go back to try to blog about it. And in that interim, this medic, Arafa, went out on another call, and he went with another young medic, and they were going to a place that there had been another bombing. One person was dead. Somebody else was injured. He was standing in his uniform at the back of his ambulance, and an Israeli tank shelled him with a dart bomb. So he was shredded and died. So that is one thing that I always thought, like, I should have been with him. But, even if I had been, I wouldn't change the situation.
Yeah, I think Well, what I perceive as the targeting of medics and journalists, right, that we've seen in this most recent iteration of the conflict there has really been striking because it's so, I think it's so much better documented, again, with people on the ground than perhaps before, that it really puts things into perspective. Before we jumped into the stream, Eva mentioned that she was kind of a witness to the drone attack that happened out, in the Moscow region. So can you tell us a little bit about that, because it's so recent?
Sure. I didn't see the attack, but so basically where I live, it's in the vicinity of where one woman, 46-year-old woman, was killed. It's not that far away. And so what was it? Just after 2 yesterday morning, I woke up and I didn't realize why I woke up. And then after I kind of like was fully awake, I understood that I woke up because I heard air defense shooting at something, so a drone. And then over the next course of the next some hours, I don't remember how many air defense shots there were, but they're very loud. And the only reason I make that point is that my dogs were bothered by it, and one of them was panicking. So I was awake the rest of the early morning trying to calm her. But because I was awake, I could hear the sound of drones. Now it was a different sound because in Gaza, we heard the drones directly above, and not just one, but like tens or dozens or even hundreds, I don't know. And so it was a very chaotic sound, like a train wreck in the sky, like, all these different tones clashing above you. What I heard yesterday morning, it wasn't above me, it was in the region. So it was a different type of sound. It wasn't the same buzzing sound, but it's definitely a drone, and it was kind of coming and going. And so I didn't see the attacks, but then, again, I heard all the air defense. And then the news came in that 3 buildings in this district, not too far from where I am, were hit by drone attacks. So today I actually went. Yesterday I had obligations, I couldn't get there, but today I went and actually met with a friend's sister who lived in one of the buildings, not a building that was attacked, but she and her boyfriend were in the building, in the apartment. And after they heard the air defense, they woke up. And she heard, it was one of the buildings was impacted first. And she went out and she was standing on the balcony and she was able to film the impact of the building directly across where the woman was killed. And so basically she was just telling me about that. And I filmed to the 3 buildings today. So there's pretty massive holes in each of the 3 buildings. Thankfully, it wasn't more than one person killed, but it's still tragic that one person was killed. It's completely, like, I made sure to film, of course, that it is a completely civilian area. There's nothing, just like in Donetsk when they attacked, there's nothing military there. It was shocking that they reached to it's the southeast of Moscow. And about 10 days prior, they also sent drones into this region. It was a bit later. It was around 6 or 6:30 or so that I woke to the air defense. So, yeah.
How is it perceived? How is it perceived there? Is it perceived as terrorism? Because, like you're saying, it's not like there's a military target and collateral damage happens to be civilian. It's a purely residential area. Almost, it sounds like it's almost a suburb. So there's really nothing there to attack. So from where I sit, it seems to be this desperate acts in the plural, right, of intimidation and terrorism. But how is it being perceived by the locals?
So, I mean, I wasn't able to talk to that many locals. But the young woman I was speaking with, she was like, we don't know how to deal with it. We're not accustomed to it. So unfortunately in Kursk now they've become accustomed to it. In Donbass, they've had since 2014 for it to become normal. So when Ukraine shells there, depending on how it is, people either just like, it's normal, or they at least run to the basement or something. Here, people don't have the instincts because they haven't been experiencing that. So that's one thing she emphasized to me. By the way, I actually met a man from Kursk in this district. So I was filming one of the buildings and talking with this young lady, about her experience. And then this man walked by and he said something. We ended up talking. And so then I asked, when it came out that he was from Kursk, I asked if I could film him. So I did. I have to go back. I don't remember exactly everything he said, but I think he said he'd come from Kursk because of the situation there. come here about a week ago, and then this happens. He did stress that in Kursk, people, the army and people are doing their utmost to help the civilians there with humanitarian supplies, and obviously the people there are grateful for that. But so I can't say, like, for example, I can't say exactly what, if people here are saying is terrorism. I'm saying is terrorism. The friends I know are saying is terrorism. It's clearly terrorism, and as you rightly said, it seems like an act of desperation, and also, Kiev trying to show that they can that they're winning. Their desperate, unhinged belief that they're winning. By striking, because I guess they monitor Telegram channels. So the fact that people will be terrified because they're not accustomed to these drone attacks, then Kiev tries to politicize that and monetize that by saying, look, we're instilling fear in the heart of Moscow, but it's really terrorism.
Would you draw parallels between the Kiev government and some of these actual self-proclaimed rebel groups in other places that you've seen? Because this is sort of the official government. I mean, minus the fact that Zelensky lost his mandate and he's technically a president who is not a president. But do you see any of that here, or are the two very different?
No, the parallel is the terrorism of civilian areas. So, like, what if you're referring to when you said so-called rebels, I assume you meant in Syria, correct?
Right. Somewhere like
Yeah.
Syria, basically these AQ and other groups like that.
Yeah, so like in my experience in Damascus, from 2014 on, like when I would stay in the old city, they would choose the terrorists in Eastern Ghouta would choose times when they knew there'd be the most people on the streets. So morning when people are going to work or children were going to school, that's when they would send the mortars, or late afternoon when people are coming from school and work. And so the intent was to kill as many people as possible, maim as many people as possible. I don't know if in their warped mind they thought that would force the people to turn against the government, but logically it wouldn't, because people knew who was doing it. If anything, it bolstered support for the government. And that seems to be what Kiev is doing as well. Like that's what they've been doing to the Donbass republics for years, and to Kursk now, and other areas on the border with Ukraine. So it's definitely, there's the parallel of this infantile mindset thinking that, and also the disregard for lives. And I mean, that's also, Israel, how they view Palestinians as not human, how Kiev views people in the Donbass or Russians in general as not human. That's another parallel that is very important, because, I have to stress, I don't know if people believe me when I say it, but when I talk with people in the Donbass or here, I don't hear the same hatred for Ukrainians. Yeah, for Kiev. Yeah, for the Nazis, but not for average Ukrainians. I don't hear that. And I'm sure there must be random people that have that hatred, but it's not overwhelmingly what I hear. And even when I went to one front line outside of Donetsk before Avdiivka, and spoke with commanders there with a couple other journalists, and asked them, like, do you have friends in Ukraine? Of course we do. Do you hate Ukrainians? Of course we don't. We hate Kiev. We hate what they're doing. But to Ukrainians, no, we don't hate them. So I do think that's important to mention, because this hatred that the regime in Kiev has, or the Israeli regime has for Palestinians, or the terrorist and their backers had for Syrian civilians, especially civilians that were Alawis from the coastal areas. Oh, they hated those people. I've not seen that, including in Gaza. In Gaza, one of the most battered places on earth, I did not see the hatred, in spite of what the propagandists say, I did not see the hatred for Jews in general or for Israelis in general. The hatred was for the system that was oppressing them. So I think that's an important point.
It definitely is, because I think usually the perception is when there is war, there's the logical consequence of dehumanization, and it happens all across the board. But what you're describing then is actually much more specific, and more specific, like you're saying, to the governments that are carrying out these attacks on the civilian population. Marcelo, I see a lot of statements in the live stream. Eva, you're being complimented, but do we have any questions that we have not addressed?
Well, not address, not well, yeah, a couple, but we kind of address
As we go, as we've been going.
as we go. Exactly, she mentioned a lot of. So there are three questions, and they are consecutive. It was perfect. I made a print of it so I could not lose them in the on the way. That caught my attention on the beginning of the stream, which were, so who cares? This is
That's a screen name.
then
That's
a
a screen
screen
name.
name of
Oh,
someone that's
it's not the
always on
question.
the.
Not the question.
Okay.
It's not the question. So who cares asked, crazy. So they actually like communism in Venezuela. I think this is a subject for a whole big screen, but I'll just address this now. Who cares? You need to learn Portuguese and follow my channel a little bit closer. I've seen you there, but you wanna say something about that?
Well, I will say with the caveat that, you know, I have my experience in Venezuela in 2010, but I was there for personal reasons and not, I wasn't very political aside from Palestine. In 2019, I was there for, I think, at most between 3 and 4 weeks. What I can say is that there is massive support for the government, and people are very well educated on why they support the government and what they are fighting against and what they do not want to happen to their country. So you attend one of these Chavista rallies, and you'll get people from elderly women to young men to teenagers who are able to talk about imperialism and talk about what the US is trying to do to their country, and also talk about the achievements of Chavismo. So, you know, I can't myself speak about in great detail all these things, but you will hear it. So I don't know. I think it's pretty black and white just to frame it as like, do they like communism? Do they want their own futures? Do they want to be able to determine their futures? And I'll admit my own ignorance. You can chime in, but like, I didn't know that prior to Hugo Chavez, the Afro Venezuelans and the indigenous Venezuelans were treated like subhumans. I didn't know that they were so oppressed. And sorry, I'm not laughing at it, but it's just like, it's pretty shocking. I didn't know that until 2019. So that there's my ignorance, right? But there's so many reasons why they support this Bolivarian government. So it doesn't just boil down to, you know, do you like communism or not?
No, exactly. The term that's why I said this is probably not a good question, but I would like to address it anyway, because the term communism is completely useless on this question. The second one was about H, was asked by H. Isaac, and he asked, "Can you please talk more about the interconnections of the different conflicts?" And I guess that one we kind of, build a bit of connections, and this is a entire week at least of
Yeah.
discussion. But do you want to make some quick point there that could build more than what we discussed in the last 2 hours, perhaps?
I think you're right that it's a long discussion. I guess one kind of very basic point is that um, the West doesn't want to see a country succeed if it's not kowtowing to the West dictates. So, for example, Venezuela again. The fact that Venezuela is resisting what the West tries to impose on it, or Syria, you know, they wanted to topple the Syrian government, and the Syrian people resisted that. And I mean, there's many reasons why the West wants in Venezuela for their resources, in Syria for the resources and strategic positions, but also they don't want these countries to set a standard, an example for other countries to then say, okay, we don't have to be under the thumb of the West. So I think that's another kind of common thread. But beyond that, I think it will take a lot more time to discuss all the commonalities, and that maybe that's for another conversation.
Yeah, no, for sure. This is, as I said again, to who cares, the same answer. And yeah, here she is now.
This is not
Yeah,
the
I
dog
thought-
that I thought would. This is the other dog. I wanted our similar-looking dogs to jump in at the same time, but it was
At the
it was
same
the
time.
Basset. The Basset decided to.
A last one that this I think it's more easily to talk about now. It's from P. Durpan, And the ask is, I would like to understand how I would request discussing how Western population is the most propagandized population on Earth.
I agree it is. What's to discuss?
No discussion. Answer it. Yes.
Is the question why is it, or how is it, or is it just is it?
Perhaps it raises a discussion on how Western population, but I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, I mean, maybe Nina, I don't know if you want to chime in as to
Well,
why.
I was going to say that in some of these other places like Russia, people have lived under different ideologies, so they have something to compare to. And they've also, some of the changes took place within our lifetimes. So again, there's something to compare to. So people may be a little bit more cynical and probably a little bit better educated about political topics and just generally the world. I think North Americans, and especially Americans, weirdly, because of the American status as a superpower, though it's waning, they're very, very insular and in some ways provincial. It's a very strange paradigm between, being a superpower, but at the same time being sort of isolated in thinking and perhaps not traveling like you and experiencing the world in the way that you have. I mean, there are other issues with education here too. So I think that's one part of the puzzle where people in these other places, the global south, Russia, et cetera, are a little bit more cynical. They can kind of look at the way their country's changed under different ideologies. But the other thing is, of course, existing under total ideology. I'm not a sociologist, but it is a sociological term that we've probably, you guys have probably seen. And it's just the bombardment of, a very particular kind of media, the echo chamber that we talk about, the academia, the lower education and public schools, all of that combined creates a worldview where you think you are independent thinking because you may disagree whether it's, Coke or Pepsi, but you're not really going beyond that. And you, in some ways, sometimes even those of us who are more free thinking than that, it's difficult to escape our own timelines, right? There's a limit to that too. But I think that's another component where the Western propaganda is so insidious, and it's been more mild than perhaps, let's say Soviet propaganda of, the heyday of the Soviet Union, where it's more difficult to discern. It's not sort of in your face. Although now that a lot of social media and being able to access other narratives and the other side of the story, that's definitely crumbling. I don't know if it's crumbling fast enough. I mean, there's a reason why readership and viewership of traditional media sources is down, and it has been down and seems to still be down and even declining. But I think there are different pieces of the puzzle to explain that. So it's definitely a question that could be explored in an entire new episode. But you're someone who's traveled extensively, and you see it on the ground. You see that difference in thinking. You just mentioned Venezuela and people being educated enough, right, to be able to analyze their circumstances, but also what's coming to them from the outside, and whether these, foreign powers actually mean well when they want to, privatize all their natural resources or something like that. So yeah, I think these questions are great, but they're sort of topics for maybe another discussion where we can elaborate on them a little bit fuller. Marcella, do you have any final questions? Because we've had poor Eva for actually both of your ends in Eurasian continent.
I have a
is
live stream in a couple of hours.
Yeah.
No, I'm okay. I think I even over addressed today. I promise I was not mansplaining. It's just because I really had a couple of contributions that I think it were important to make people understand more positively on what you said. Plus, of course, I had my own doubts and questions. And I think the last one I think Nina asked, was exactly about the Russian population reacting on these types of pinprick attacks, terrorist attacks. We can call it different names. They are all insidious and not useful at all, but, I think it's more useful for the Russians that they do that, because people just seem to crystallize more on its own country, on its own government, and on the situation. So is that was my last question, but I think I'm okay with
You're
everything.
okay with the answer. Well, thank you so much, Eva. This has been very, very elucidating. Again, like I mentioned earlier, I love the fact that you're very, very specific with examples, and even the way you speak, you're describing things in a way that are, that is very easy for a visual person like me to imagine in my mind. So I can understand why you still want to do old school writing. Well, some people consider it old school. I like writing too. So I think that's been very, very helpful. Do you have any parting words as to what you're working on now, what you might be pursuing, in the next year, so that our viewers can find you? Obviously, you're linked in all the links in the description box as well. But is there anything else that they may not know about?
Well, in the short term, I have some more videos from Crimea. I mean, nothing earth-shattering, but might be of interest to people. The take on people in Crimea as to if it matters, referendum in Russia, etc. I have, what else do I have? I've been doing interviews with interesting people, as you do, so I have some of those coming out soon too. And I am going to finally embark on writing a book, again, old school. So I don't have a timeline for that. It will be a first. In spite of all the writing I've done, I have not written a book, but it's really time for me to do so. So it will probably, the first one will be a look at kind of like the conversation we've had tonight, a look at the various aspects of places that I've been reporting from, the commonalities, etc. But above and beyond, first and foremost, I guess, I always want to give voice to the people that I've had these experiences with. It's, it's not about me, it's about them. So that's something I do want to be working on, but that I don't have a timeline for it. I guess anything else you'll see on the different places that you've shared with people.
Yes, and if you guys are not seeing Eva on your platform, even though you're subscribed to her, go directly, which is what I've had to do on Twitter/X. Oh, this is number 2.
Yes.
We both got number 2s that do not look alike. Oh my goodness. Adorable. Oh. This is our second dog episode. In the previous episode, we talked about animals from the get-go, and some people got very upset that we're talking about pets instead of politics. And I think we're showing what truly matters, ultimately. Our family members, including our canine family members. Well, Eva, thank you so much. We would love to have you back. We'll see how this episode does with this hopefully lack of censorship. So this is also a little test, I think, in terms of doing topics that we've discussed today. Thank you guys for watching, and we will see you in the next one. Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Marcella.
Thank you both. Thank you both.
Thank you, everybody. And remember to like, share, subscribe. We're going to have all the links for Nina on the description and for Eva. And see you guys next time. Bye-bye. Bye, guys. Bye, Eva. Bye, Nina.